Hello, boys and girls. We're back for Chapter 2 of Gifted Hands, the Ben Carson story. Thank you for coming back for another chapter. Ben felt sad about leaving his home and friends in Michigan to live in a tenement building in Boston. But it wasn't very long before he found there was definitely an upside to living with the Averys, his aunt and uncle. Their children were grown, so they had a lot of love to show two young boys. That first Christmas the Carsons lived in Boston, Ben's aunt and uncle and their mother showered them with gifts. Ben's favorite present was a chemistry set. He spent hours in his room reading the instruction, mixing chemicals, and watching them react. One of his experiments left the apartment smelling like rotten eggs. Ugh! Ben thought it was hilarious. Not everything about the move was positive, however. Ben hated the rats that roamed in packs in the weeds behind the apartment building. Big rats. Ugly rodents that were nearly as big as cats. And lots of them. The horrid creatures usually stayed away from the building, but in the cold weather, the rats sometimes took refuge in the basement. Once a snake slithered into the basement. Someone killed it, but afterwards all the neighborhood kids told stories about snakes eating children. Between the rats he'd seen and the snakes he'd heard about, Ben was always afraid to go down in the basement. When they did feel the need for outdoor adventure, Ben and Curtis often played in a park not far from their apartment building. There they imagined their own mountain climbing and Wild West exploits as they scampered up and over and around large rock formations. One day, Ben climbed across the face of a rock wall on a dangerously high and narrow ledge. With one hand firmly jammed in a crack, he plastered his body against the rock as tightly as he could, slowly easing himself forward and feeling for some place, any place, to hold with his other hand. Suddenly, a chunk of the ledge gave way beneath his feet. Ben was now dangling by just one hand. He listened to the sound of the broken rock hitting the ground far below. He looked, and just one arm's length ahead, the remaining ledge looked wider and stronger. But how could he get there? He needed a new handhold to reach it. From where Ben hung, he spotted another crevice he thought he could reach with his free hand. If he could get a good grip there, he could swing himself onto that ledge. The trouble was, he could see a thick spider web stretching across the opening. Now, Ben loved all kinds of animals. Well, almost all kinds of animals. He absolutely hated spiders. They terrified him. And he had seen some humongous wolf spiders with webs just like this one in the rocks of that park. He thought, there's no way I'll stick my hand in that nest of wolf spiders. But then he looked down. He was a long way up, and the ground below was rocky. He did not want to think about how badly he would be hurt if he fell from this height. He was terrified of spiders, but right then he was more afraid of falling. I need that handhold in the crevice, Ben told himself. So he stretched. He put his hand right through that spider's web into that opening in the rock. He got a solid grip, swung his feet onto the ledge, and quickly scampered safely off that rock wall. Ben learned an important lesson. Sometimes to survive, you need to face your fears and overcome them. The added sense of danger Ben experienced living in Boston wasn't merely the result of a young boy's fertile imagination. His new neighborhood was definitely rougher than the one he had left in Detroit. He often encountered homeless drunks sleeping on the sidewalk outside his apartment building. All hours of the day, police cars raced through the streets, their sirens blasting and their lights flashing. One of the Avery sons, his aunt and uncle's sons, was shot to death on those streets. Ben had liked and looked up to that young adult cousin, but in addition to feeling a terrible sadness over his cousin's senseless death, Ben realized his cousin had been associating with drug dealers, had been doing some things he shouldn't have been doing when he was killed. But that too was a valuable lesson. Ben made up his mind right then. Some things are just not worth that risk. While the Carson family lived in Boston, Ben's mother made 2 or 3 more visits to relatives for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, but Ben and Curtis never questioned why she had to leave. They trusted Aunt Jean and Uncle William to take great care of them. Ben and Curtis were usually a little bit spoiled by the time their mother returned. In Boston, just as she had in Detroit, Ben's mother worked for several well-to-do families caring for their children or cleaning their houses. Many days she left for work early in the morning before her boys went to school and didn't get home until almost bedtime. Just the same, she always took time to ask Ben and Curtis what they were doing and learning in school, no matter how tired she was or how many hours she had worked that day. Ben and his brother knew that their mother thought their education was important and that she wanted them to do well in school. And they did. Both boys did well in their classes in the small private school they attended in Boston. Ben's mother wanted her sons to learn the importance of setting goals in life. Almost every day she talked to Ben and Curtis about her own goal of saving enough money to someday move back to their house in Detroit. Sonia Carson also taught her sons the value of $1. For instance, riding on the school bus on the city bus cost 20 cents a day, the same price as a loaf of bread. So Ben and Carson rode their bikes to school, and the money they saved was used to buy groceries for their family. Ben's mother liked to say, "A penny saved is a penny earned." The boys learned to never be late returning a library book, and they never walked past an alley without looking to see if they could spot a bottle that they could turn in for a penny deposit. No amount of money was too small when it came to spending or saving. There were other important lessons Sonia managed to teach her sons. When Ben was reminded of one of them, the day a store clerk made the mistake of giving him too much change. Instead of a $1 bill, she handed Ben a $10 bill. Even before he walked out the door of the store, he realized the mistake. He excitedly began to fantasize. What can I do with this extra $9? But by the time he reached home, he had a knot in his stomach, the size of the fist in which he still clutched the extra money. And he was no longer feeling so great about his good fortune. He recognized the feeling that he was experiencing. It was guilt. He knew keeping the money wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be honest. And honesty was an important principle he'd learned from his mother as well as at church. Ben immediately turned around and walked back to the store, where he returned the $10 bill to the clerk and explained what had happened. She gave him the correct change, and he strode out of the store $9 poorer, but feeling on top of the world. Recalling the incident years later, Ben would say, "That experience reinforced for me an even more important truth than the value of honesty. It reminded me that there is such a thing as right and wrong. And when you do what is right, based on the principles you believe in, the satisfaction that results is better than having money. During the 2 years in Boston, the Carson family saved enough pennies and nickels and dimes to move back to Michigan. They still couldn't afford to live in the little house on Deacon Street, but they were closer, and the boys were glad to be near their old friends. However, a few weeks after they returned to school in Detroit, both Ben and Curtis realized they had a serious problem. In Boston, they had been among the better students in their classes, but in Detroit, they were behind their classmates. Ben understood so little of what his class was studying that he began to fear his dreams of becoming a missionary doctor were drifting out of reach. He also began to believe what the other kids were saying about him. And that's the end of chapter 2. And chapter 3 will be up before long.